Okay, now for our next look. This is primarily the material in chapter 16 that's actually been updated out of your book. And so this is the politics and the economy. So we're going to talk about things like the budget deficit, entitlements, and so on and so forth. But we'll spend more time when it comes to entitlements with social welfare policy, which is the next chapter. All right, as you know, as we've talked about, the deficit is when, or occurs when, you spend more money than you're bringing in. That's the nice way of saying it. When we talk about expenditures, that's the money that we're spending. When we talk about revenues, that's the money that we're bringing in. And it is important that these revenues exceed expenditures. But instead, in the American experience, expenditures exceed revenue. And every year we spend a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And next thing you know, we have what's known as our national debt, which is at $16.7 trillion. And the national debt is simply the total amount of deficits we've had since George Washington was president. Now, they were relatively under control until the 1980s. Excuse me. They started building under Reagan. There was a Cold War dividend, in essence. In the 1990s, we actually began to reduce the national debt a little because in 1998 and 1999, we had actually budget surpluses rather than budget deficits. But what's happened is that the debt is now currently about 40% of GDP, and it's actually increased since then. We saw the other day where it had climbed even from that, and that's a danger signal that we don't have our finances under control. So it's something that we need to fix. Now this looks at how things have accelerated when it comes to the cumulative reports from the executive office, and we can see that how things started, kind of, in essence, just kind of muddling along through the 50s into the 60s. And what's interesting is in the 1950s and 60s, national defense accounted for almost half of all spending. But 1960s, we start the establishment of the entitlement programs like Medicare, and these begin to take off and take off and take off and take off and take off until now we're at this point. Ooh, I don't know where we're going from here. And it's now even steeper. So that's kind of the history of our thing. And you can see here, this is federal spending. And this is the gross national debt as it goes up. Our spending has increased, but certainly not at the rate that the national debt has risen. Now the two major things, as we saw in the national debt clock the other day, the two things that are driving the deficit is, one, Social Security, which is now the number 2, and Medicare, which is now the number 1 item in the budget. Just a couple years ago, Social Security was number 1, and I think your book has Social Security 1, Defense 2, Medicare 3 or 4. Now Medicare is number 1, and it makes for unpredictability, because we do know in general how many people are retiring. We do know that people are living longer. The fastest growing segment of the population are those over the age of 80. Numbers wise, they're not huge numbers, but what we have to remember is that when you do get to that age, you're much more likely to get sick, and you are much more likely to find yourself needing a greater amount of medical care, which is expensive for somebody in their 80s and 90s who is not in good health, but at the same time their body doesn't give up. And of course, we can't euthanize people. It's not in our societal makeup to do that. But we do allow people who are terminally ill, like in Oregon and in Washington, to end their lives on their terms rather than our terms. Okay, now, the policy debate over the deficit and the balanced budget has been around for quite a while. It seems to have peaked in 2010. It was an issue in 2012, but people, I guess, decided that they wanted to continue on the path that they are on. And obviously there's going to be consequences to that. But neither party seems to have a will, though the Republicans seem to be a little bit more going down that route to trying to fix the deficit, which, this great rise in the deficit starts with them, but then it amplifies under the current president. I have not seen a balanced budget amendment, though the Tea Party has talked about balancing the budget. If we have to in our houses, then the government should have to. I always used to think that tying Congress's hands during a crisis would not be a good thing, but honest to God, the kind of spending that we have, something needs to happen. So under Republicans, we know that economic growth and tax relief is, for them, intertwined. Now, in 2001, they passed the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, one of only 3 large tax cuts since World War II. Those have been commonly referred to as the Bush tax cuts. And those Bush tax cuts expired, I believe, this year, as they were part of the financial agreements that came due on January 1st. So I'm going to change pins here. Let me see, Bush tax cuts. And this is what the fight's been since 2007, 2008. Democrats, on the other hand, most tax cuts for them, or that supported, ended in 2010. And spending was therefore increased to many of the federal programs, which of course accelerated. If you accelerate spending and you're still not bringing in much more in the way of revenue, then you're going to also accelerate the deficit for the year and the debt overall. That's what happened. I don't care if you're a huge supporter of the president. You have to admit, you have to take that in, that's what's happened. You can't continue to spend more money than we're taking in and not have a detrimental effect in the long run. And that's where we're kind of heading. Now, we know that economic forecasts are always uncertain. On September 11th, the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, the subsequent military actions in Iran and Afghanistan had significant economic implications. That was coupled with the fact that starting in the 1990s, there had been a push to put more people in houses that they owned. All of it seemed to come to a head 2007, 2008, and we found ourselves in a recession. Now, we're pretty good until this time, 2007, 2008, the recession occurs. And that is mitigated by, not mitigated, but that is amplified by the housing crisis and the banking crisis of that year. Thanks. In a recession, tax revenues decrease. Why? Because people aren't working. Unemployment goes up. And spending on social programs may increase. In fact, under the Democrats, they have increased. Unemployment, disability, food stamps, welfare, you name it, those entitlement programs have increased. That's what it is. So we can see what happens with the guesses. We see here that the actual spending in billions sometimes plateaus, like it does here, and sometimes it goes down like it does here, then accelerates back up. And we don't even see what happens in 2001 when 9/11 occurs. But we can also see that what's interesting here is this is this is an era when the projected spending was supposed to go down, and yet the actual spending went up. Now, we could afford to do that because at this time we still have what's known as a budget surplus available to us, and we'll have for at least 2 years, I think 98, 99. And this projected here probably started to go up after this, and this may have filtered down. But it's always hard to figure out because you just don't know what is going to go on. Perhaps, at this point, the actual expenditures were supplemented by the fact that the economy really started going gangbusters. What's interesting here is that the actual spending is going down, and this is a recession in this time period. Not a period of robust economic performance. Now, voters, when they vote their pocketbooks for the most part. 2012 might be an aberration to that. But voters see connections between the nation as a whole and their own situations. Usually. Again, 2012 might be an anomaly to that. So voting behavior and economic conditions are somewhat correlated, but they're not always correlated at the national and individual levels. So people don't always vote in line with their pocketbooks, but most often they do. Certainly 1992 is the best example of that, when people did. When people tried to tell George Bush on his side, talk about the economy. Well, the economy was in the doldrums, and it seemed as if Bush was out of touch, which helped Clinton win that year with 43% of the vote. And that then starts a process that Clinton gets lucky, like he seems to always have been lucky. 1992, 1993, we're already on an upturn, and then they really figure out what to do with the internet, starting about 1992, and with personal computers. And the amount, or the jumps in productivity that occur in the 1990s provides a real good base for the growth that we enjoyed as a nation at that time. And so it's very difficult to hear politicians talk about going back to 1992. The conditions are so different. We don't have anything on the horizon that will extraordinarily change our life, like the internet did with the Americans in 1992. Now, our officials are short-sighted. They're tempted to take a short-term view of the economy. They want to satisfy the voter immediately. It's very difficult to talk to the voter about the long term, because voters don't want to hear what's going to happen in 10 years. They want to know what's going to happen this year versus next year, or next year versus 5 years from now. They can't see, most people can't see that type of distance, because they want to know what you're going to do for them tomorrow. So the long term usually loses out in the way politicians produce their plans or talk about their plans for the economy. The government really does not know how to produce all desirable outcomes. So therefore, why should we rely on them? They should be there to help us fall through the bottom, to keep from falling through the bottom. But they shouldn't be the vehicle to be looked to as to the one that provides the outcomes. And then all the economic pressures are often interrelated. So just look at the buy of planes that we would be giving to Egypt. Even sometimes foreign policy is an example of economic pressures. Lockheed wants the U.S. government to buy those 15 or 20 or 25 F-15s that will be given to Egypt for $1. Because number one, it provides jobs for the highly paid Lockheed workforce, which continually needs to be fed, either, in this case, primarily with military-related programs, since they're no longer in the commercial air programs. But economic pressures are often very related. We have subsidies for dairy farmers because we want to keep more dairy farmers in business rather than fewer. So we bite the bullet and we spread subsidies out to dairy farmers to make sure that they don't go out of business. So economic pressures are often very interrelated between programs. Okay, now ideology, of course, plays a large role in shaping policy choices. You have small government Republicans, I'll just call them GOP, versus big government Democrats. So Democrats tend and this plays out in the way that we approach economic problems. Democrats tend to want to reduce unemployment. Republicans tend to want to reduce inflation. It's just the two economic flavors in both parties. Because the Democrats played to this crowd because people who tend to vote Democrat are lower or middle socioeconomic level, and they're the first, usually, except in this last recession, to get laid off. Republicans, on the other hand, middle class and upper middle class, even though that's changing because of Southern voters, and they tend to want to make sure, excuse me, that their dollar goes farther, and they don't want their dollar or the value of their dollar eaten up by inflation. So Democrats always about unemployment, usually. Republicans usually about inflation. Now, as we talked about yesterday, majoritarian politics, bringing a number of groups into the process, yields conflicting recommendations. We all want lower taxes. Yay! We all want lower taxes. And that will translate into less debt. Maybe. But it really doesn't. Because what lower taxes do, and we're going to erase this just for a second, is lower taxes, if we don't reduce our spending, can lead to larger deficits. But if we create less debt, that means that new programs can't be initiated because someone or somehow they have to be paid for. So usually you see the GOP in this camp, you see the Democrats in this camp, and there's no, at this time, no middle. And you can't have lower taxes and less debt unless you lower spending. There's no way to do it. So meaningful tax cuts are politically difficult. New programs tend to be more popular with politicians because they can go to the voters and say, look what I'm doing for you. Or they can always find some meaningful way. It's like California, they did a poll about adopting Michael Bloomberg's ban on huge soft drinks. And Californians would give the proposal no more than 40%. But when they're told that the tax money, the new program, will go toward social programs at schools, suddenly, the support for a ban on 16-ounce or larger than 16-ounce drinks jumps to 68%, because we like new programs, which tend to create, at least for somebody, something that's beneficial. But we don't think of the larger picture. We think of what now. We tend to not think of what we did 2 or 4 years ago. We think about the now. And we have a political system that's so broken that we don't remind voters that this is what you did 2 years ago. And you want to add more to that because voters have short memories. And they're also very impressed by the ads that are put out by interest groups and PACs and 527s. So look at the tax burden. Tax burdens in democratic nations as a percentage of income of families with 2 children. We can see that we are not at all one of the highest taxed countries. Yet at the same time, look at some of these countries that are really struggling financially. Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, France, Italy, Japan, where the taxes are high. In fact, France is getting ready to raise theirs on top earners to 75%. Hence, Gerard Depardieu, the great French actor, moved to another country. Other wealthy French are moving to other countries. They're taking their money with them. That's how you, I guess when you're rich enough, you can make a statement by walking away from the country that you perhaps love. Now, let's look at a couple of the different ways that governments look at the economy. Now, the first thing we'll look at is monetarism. Now, monetarism simply means that when inflation occurs, or inflation does occur, when there is too much money chasing too few goods. And monetarist advocates advocate increasing the money supply at a rate about equal to the economic growth and then letting the free market operate. And that can work. But remember, just let's keep in mind what this is as we go and look at the other flip side of it. Then there's Keynes and what's known as Keynesianism. Now, Keynes starts developing his theory in 1910. And the theory revolves around the fact that the health of the economy depends on what fraction of their incomes people save or spend. And when demand is low, the government should pump money into the economy by spending more than it collects in taxes. Because if they can stimulate the economy, then they will get that money back as economic expansion occurs and more people are back at work and they're now paying taxes. And so the deficit that you create up front, you get back at the end. Unfortunately, you have to do a couple different things. And I've never seen Keynesian economics work exactly the way Keynes said it does. Now, this is the type of monetary system that Roosevelt adopts in the 1930s. It's something that Hoover, I think, only does in 1931, 32, when he begins to spend more money. FDR goes into it whole hog. The problem, of course, at least for the first 4 years, is that the Supreme Court keeps overturning some of these programs. But FDR really, probably out of desperation, looks at Keynesianism as the way to get out. And does it increase the economy a little bit? Does it put more people back to work? Hey, they're able to cut the unemployment rate from perhaps 25% down to 15%. But it doesn't solve the problem. Now, supply side is something that I heard for the first time during the Reagan administration. It's predicated on the fact that there is a need for less government, and that smaller government therefore should interfere less in the market, and they should not only not interfere in the market, but they should lower taxes on all consumers. The lower taxes would create incentives for investment, because what are you going to do with all that extra money? Well, you want to make more. So you invest, you create new businesses, you expand the business you have, you do whatever, but you invest that money because you're going to pay less taxes on it. That creates a greater economic productivity that will produce more tax revenue. Therefore, that's how, in this way, the government gets the money back. They lower taxes, so there's a circuit in revenue coming in, but at the same time, they have to spend less. That was the problem with the Reagan administration. They didn't create less government. They lowered taxes. They did produce greater economic productivity after the doldrums of the 1970s, late 1970s. They did produce more tax revenue, but at the same time, they were also spending more. So Reagan starts, in small ways compared to today, the deficits of the budget deficit, the national debt that we have now really does start to increase in the 1980s under Reagan. Now, Reaganomics, like I just said, did all of this. I've forgotten that I had this slide here. There's monetarism, there's supply side, and there's tax cuts, and there's cutting the domestic budget, except that was erased by military spending that increased sharply. I worked on the B-1B bomber program. Others I knew worked on the B-2 bomber program. They were spending tons of money on the military in order to drive the USSR into a corner. Ultimately, they did. Now, theoretically, we should have received a Cold War dividend from that, and kind of we did. But the money supply was controlled. They cut inflation. And the stagflation of the Carter years was erased. Inflation was down. Interest rates rose. And that was an unexpected outcome, because interest rates were supposed to remain low, but because they didn't cut this, the domestic budget, or they increased this, the military budget, interest rates rose. And so in my first house, I paid well over 10% for interest on a loan, because they just could not bring down interest rates. Not exactly the way that the supply side is supposed to work. Now also, in Reagan's time, they cut the personal income tax level, but the Social Security taxes were increased because there was an observation that the nation was growing older. The baby boomers, many of them are only 20, 25 years into their careers, so it's going to be a while. But the Social Security fund was lagging, and so they needed to increase the revenue into the Social Security trust funds. Also, this was not wanted, but apparently to the administration it was tolerable, the large deficits. But they dramatically increased the size of the national debt. You can't talk about Reagan and not talk about that. At the same time, they stimulated the economy. Unemployment decreased, business activity increased. You can't argue. The 1980s were, up until at least 88, there was a feeling of good times. Then, then we had the stock market crash, a recession in 91, early into 92, and then we have the 8 good years of Clinton. Now, who helps the president make? Remember, this is a review. The CEA, the Council of Economic Advisors, these are all professional economists that are sympathetic to the president's view of economics. So President Obama has big government, Keynesian type people, Austin Goolsbee, who's now teaching at the University of Chicago, was one of those people on the Council of Economic Advisors. There's the OMB, which prepares estimates of amounts to be spent by the federal government. They negotiate the agency budgets. They then put all that together, and they turn that budget over to the House and the Senate. The Secretary of the Treasury reflects the point of the view of the financial community. I think the new Treasury Secretary is Jack Lew. Usually you try to pick a banker, someone who has familiarity and ties with the financial community to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, the Federal Reserve is what I asked you to look at the other night. Members are appointed by the President. They are confirmed by the Senate. They serve non-renewable 14-year terms. They can be removed for cause, but that doesn't really happen. They're somewhat independent of both the President and the Congress, which means the President cannot call them up and say, hey, I need you to lower interest rates this month, and Congress can't do the same. But they do listen. They do listen because they realize that they live in a political, or they are kind of a political animal. And we don't want them to be one of those federal agencies that is so independent that they're truly not recognizing what is going on out in the community and not being able to respond. So they keep their nose and their ears pretty close to the ground. And right now, of course, we have a discount rate of 0%. So banks, this is the bank for banks, they borrow money at 0%. And because the discount rate is at 0, they're able to loan money out at considerably lower rates than we're used to historically. Now we know that the Federal Reserve regulates the supply and the price of money by controlling the money supply. They set the monetary policy. The effort in the monetary policy is to shape the economy by controlling the amount of money and bank deposits and the interest rates charged for that money. That's their primary job, by controlling the amount of money in circulation and the bank deposits and the interest rates charged for that money. Now the budget is something that we've also talked about from the perspective of the legislative branch and the executive branch. But it simply is a document that originates in the executive branch that once it's put together by the OMB and looked over by the President and his staff, I guess, it tells us how much the government will collect in taxes, how much it will spend in revenues, and how those expenditures will be allocated among various programs. Now the fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. So when you hear someone talk about the fiscal year, it's probably a better thing. I'm not always sure why, but my assumption is ending the fiscal year at the end of the summer rather than during the holiday season is just one less piece of stress that businesses would have to undergo. Now the President submits the budget to the House and Senate budget committees. You're going to be looking at that document from the White House and also the document that comes from Paul Ryan, who is chairman of the House Budget Committee. The House and Senate budget committees will analyze the budget. They will get information and counsel from the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group of economists. Each committee proposes to its House a budget resolution that sets a total budget ceiling and ceilings for each of the several spending areas. So what they've done is they've authorized this type of spending, but they haven't appropriated any money for it yet. Now, Congress at this point considers appropriations bills and sees whether they are congruent with the budget resolution that is passed or come out of the House and Senate budget committees. The appropriations bills themselves cannot make big changes in the budget because approximately 2/3 of government spending is entitlement. Number one is Social Security, is Medicare, no longer Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And number two is Social Security. Number four is income protection. And number five is national debt, the payment of national debt interest. So, as some of you who have talked to me already, it's not easy cutting the budget. Because the number 3 item can be reduced, that's defense. The number 6 item is federal pensions. Well, those can't be reduced either. So less and less of the budget each fiscal year becomes less changeable because all of these programs require, because of the growth of people who are using their services, more money. Now, the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, this is the first time that we have things like the CBO, things like the budget committees. And for a modern country, I think we kind of needed those institutional parts to come into being. Now, the Gramm-Rubin Balanced Budget Act, we talked about this in the executive branch and in the bureaucratic branch, called for automatic cuts from 1986 to 1991. The cuts were supposed to occur until the federal deficit disappeared, which meant that the government was spending no more than they were taking in. If there was a lack of agreement between the president and Congress on the total spending level, there would be automatic across-the-board cuts, what they call sequestration, or they call this a sequester. The president and Congress right now are using a word that kind of is based on this root word of sequester. They call it sequestration, which called in for automatic cuts of 2.45%, I think it was. And still, the president and Congress found ways to increase spending. Because again, they're not looking at the bigger picture, they're looking at the small picture. They're looking at what's good for their constituents who want them to bring home the bacon. Now, in 1990, Congress voted a tax increase, and the Budget Enforcement Act capped non-entitlement, or what's called discretionary spending. Non-entitlement means it's money that can move up and down, education, health, interior, labor, things like that. But what happened was and what did occur was that if entitlement spending increased, there had to be cuts in discretionary spending or taxes had to be raised. Well, politicians don't want to raise taxes, so we began, at least in the late 80s, early 90s, spending even more money until at least 1999. Now, until the income tax was introduced in 1913, along with the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the 16th Amendment, most revenue came from tariffs. That's why government was small. There wasn't a lot of revenue to run government on. And we do know that taxes varied when we were either at war, World War I, World War II, or at peace, when we reduced them in the late 40s, early 1950s. And that is typical up until current, because here we are fighting 2 incursions, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and with the Bush tax cuts starting in 2001, we actually had lower revenue. Of course, the economy was going higher and it was producing more revenue than expected, but we were still spending way more money than we were bringing in. So we can see what happens in this graph here. World War I, heavy spending. World War II, very heavy spending. Korean War, Vietnam War, even though it's coming down. And then the individual tax rates begin to converge with the corporate tax rates, and they've been playing a dicey game ever since then. But that's how you can see that sometimes the rich were paying almost all of their money in income taxes. Of course, they had shelters and things like that in which to hide money. But what we've seen in comparison to our European cousins is a drop in the tax rate over time until the current president who wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. We have to ask ourselves what's changed. Well, here we have no competition into the 1960s. And so economically we could get away with fighting wars and not have much in the way of economic downturns except small recessions. But then this is the rise of the conservative movement, and we see the one of the conservative mantras, the introduction of reduced tax rates in order to stimulate the economy coming into vogue. And now that's where we typically find ourselves fighting, at least politically, fighting about how much to levy in taxes on the population. Now, as far as levying taxes goes, George H.W. Bush and Clinton increased tax rates, and they kept deductions low. The balanced budget switched the policy debates to tax cuts. But here's the problem. With growing Social Security and Medicare needs, the problems have now been amplified because these programs eat up more and more and more of the budget every year, which means that we have to make some changes. We have to not allow people to retire so early. We can't promise people the world. People also have to save better in order to prepare themselves for a possible bad thing happening. So that is the end of our presentations. There's some more things I'm going to add tomorrow in a kind of minor addendum to this presentation. But make sure you take notes on this and be ready for tomorrow's quiz, 497 to 507, and Monday's quiz, 507 to 523, I think it is. And that's it.